Want to welcome everyone to the Wyandotte and Kansas Progressive Forum again. Today we have again Patrick Sumner. We're going to talk about Kansas Day because today is Kansas Day. Or I guess we're going to talk about the history of Kansas and how it became a state because today is Kansas Day. Patrick, he has a master's in American Studies from KU and his emphasis on the study of Kansas culture and history. I want to welcome you, Patrick. I hope you had a good day.
Excellent.
And so Patrick, I guess I kind of, already can maybe answer this question, but so why are we meeting on this propitious day today? It obviously is Kansas Day, but yeah.
It is propitious.
For sure.
They're propitious. People are popping corks right now, and the fireworks are flying across Kansas because today is the 160th birthday of Kansas. And Kansas Day came into being around 1914, 1915 in a small town in Kansas where the students and the teachers studied Kansas history and introduced it into a curriculum. And I'll say, I think we were both born and raised somewhat in Kansas. I know I was, and I think you were. I know you were.
Well, so raised mostly, sadly, we live so close to the border. I was actually born in Colorado, but we lived in Kansas.
Oh, that's okay.
That's good. I'm a Kansan, really. This is where I've lived, most of my life.
Kansan growing up, and you went to elementary school in Kansas.
Yeah. I went in Topeka. I went to elementary school and high school through there. So
okay. Yeah, so because of Kansas Day, which came into being about 1914 or 1915, and it was introduced into the curriculum through a book called Kansas Day, which became important at one point around 1920. When did you first learn about Kansas history? In fifth grade?
Actually, I guess we always learned about Kansas Day in school, but I know when I was in school, our eighth grade history, the whole year we learned about Kansas.
Okay.
And so basically the whole eighth grade year, our history lesson was about Kansas history. I think that's when I remember the most about it. And that, I don't know if that's because of my age and I was older, so it's easy to remember things, or I think that's when they really more emphasized it besides, the random time that we talked about it on Kansas Day, which I always remember in school, Kansas Day being a day we all celebrated, all through elementary and middle school. So, yeah.
Well, I was in fifth grade. I'm a Kansan by birth, Jayhawk by the grace of God, which is a bumper sticker. But nice. Here's my Kansas sweatshirt. But I also appreciate all of my Wildcats, my Stingers up, Emporia. What are they? Oh God!
Are they Hornets?
The Hornets, the Stingers up, and nice. The Wichita State Shockers and the Pittsburgh Gorillas. I appreciate all my Kansas academic buddies, but I'm not a prejudice, just for KU. KU was founded in 1865 by Governor Charles Robinson and became a co-educational and co-racial educational institution in Lawrence, Kansas. But anyway, we can go on and talk about Kansas Day and why it's important. So the history of the state of Kansas, the early history, is important for people to realize and know about because it's it was pivotal in the United States constitutional history in terms of, I consider the Civil War to be the second American Revolution because it solidified a lot of our foundational principles. And with the post-Civil War amendments, such as the 14th Amendment, which gave due process of federal law over state law, it identified citizenry for the formerly enslaved African Americans, and it did a lot. But it gave everybody the due process clause, and so the Senate in the Congress, the House of Representatives in the 1860s, did a lot of good. And we can move on with your questions, but I'm really happy to be here on Kansas Day.
Yeah, no, I'm glad it was on a Friday. I feel like, always the best holidays are always on the day before the weekend or on the weekend, I feel.
Absolutely.
So I guess what were some of the precursors to Kansas becoming a state then?
Okay, well, we've done a piece before, but not everybody's going to watch that. None of
Yeah,
them have
and that was
seen
kind of
that,
more
so
about
I'm
John
just going to
Brown's
go. I'm
martyrdom.
going to go into a little bit of brief precursors. Kansas was an important state or important territory before it became a state in 1861. This is 2021. That's why it's the 160th anniversary or birthday
Hmm.
and remembrance. But basically, the some of the things that happened, there was a border war on the Kansas Missouri border between the border ruffians and the Jayhawkers, who were mounted militias on both sides, and also infantry. People just like walking around didn't have a horse, but I mean people who fought one another, and there was assassinations, and there was ballot box stuffing, and there was all kinds of stuff that went on in territorial Kansas before the population emerged as being anti-slavery. So John Brown was there for a good 4 years. He was from Connecticut and lived in New York, and did a lot of good work with black farmers and different things in Lake Placid, near Lake Placid, where he's buried in upper New York. John Brown there behind you in the great mural in Kansas Capitol. No, you're fine. We can see it. But he of course got martyred or hung before the Civil War in 1859. But he was in Kansas for 4 years, I think 1855 to 1859, before he went out to Harper's Ferry. And that mural is very much a mural about the Civil War. He's a symbol, of course, of the territorial period and the Underground Railroad. But he only lived here for a good 4 years. But he was a homesteader, and he was a farmer. He had a son named John Brown Jr., which we'll come back to later in one of your other questions about the Kansas brigades and stuff like that. But it's a great mural about the Civil War starting here in Kansas, and so Kansas was famous in the eastern newspapers and the national newspapers and the local all across the West, which the West then at that time was Indiana and Iowa and Illinois. I'm not going in perfect order. Ohio,
No, yeah.
But the northern West, and it was famous in the South too because they hated Kansas, so they didn't want it to be a free state. So these are the precursors to the Civil War, and then we can move on into some of the politics and whatnot.
Yeah, so I guess mentioning the politics and stuff. What were kind of the political situation? Well, or what was the political situation like in Kansas? Or I'm sorry, excuse me, the political situation in Washington. That were important nuances, I guess, to know about, like what caused Kansas to join the Union or allowed it to join the Union.
Right. Well, Kansas was pivotal in nominating Lincoln. Excuse me. Whoops. What did I do? Kansas was pivotal in nominating Lincoln in 1860 in Chicago at the second Republican National Convention, Fremont being the first candidate. Lincoln won Lincoln, of course, famously from Illinois, won that race and went on to become the Republican candidate. Now, there were many other, the Democratic Party at that time was the party of secession. Those things all changed in the 1930s, with different demographics and things like that and different ideologies. And so we're looking at almost like a opposite situation where today, the Democrats are known for their progressive policies in different ways, and the Republicans are known for the regressive policies. But at that time, the Republicans were the progressive party of anti-slavery, and the Democrats were the party of the South, the secessionists. So what happened in the United States Congress was they had accepted the Kansas Wyandotte Constitutional Convention, which was settled in Wyandotte, right here down to what is now downtown Kansas City, Kansas. It was wasn't known. It was known as the town of Wyandotte then, without an E on the end, and was mainly founded by Wyandotte natives. It was founded by Wyandotte natives in 1843, which makes it almost as old as Westport. And it was before, Kansas was before even whites were allowed into the Kansas territory as mainstream settlers. So what was going on in Washington was Lincoln won the presidential election in November 1860, and soon after, South Carolina seceded from the Union as an individual state, and its senators left the Congress to support the basically to support themselves. Don't tread on me, South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
That's their state slogan, with the snake, and the foot and all that jazz.
Yes.
And so Lincoln became president in January 20th of 1861. Now, interestingly, many southern states senators had already left the United States Congress by the time Lincoln arrived. However, in January 21st of 1861, four senators left that day, including the most famous being Jefferson Davis, who became the president of the Confederacy. And so that was January 21st of 1861. It was because of all the secessionist senators who left the Senate, because the Kansas Constitution had already been accepted by the Congress. And so after about 13 or 14 seats were vacated in the Senate, right there in January, ending with Jefferson Davis and three others going out of the Senate, leaving the Senate to support the Southern cause and secession, Kansas became a state on January 29th. What is that? 8 days later, because they finally had the majority of votes they needed without the obstructionists from the South.
Oh man, I guess that all makes sense. I kind of knew that, but now like hearing you say that that kind of sounds I don't know, like short-sighted maybe, if they didn't want Kansas to be a free state, but
No,
but then they all left, allowing Kansas to be voted in as a free state,
member of the
basically.
Union.
Yeah,
exactly.
Member of the Union. So I mean, and what do they say, hindsight's 20/20 kind of thing, which I don't know. So I guess since that's when Kansas became a state, was it is it the territorial legislature was in Lawrence, Kansas at the time?
Okay, yes. So the farthest end of the telegraph line, and I'm not sure if they had to like roll across the Missouri to get to it or not, but it was because I don't think they didn't have poles going across
not yet,
Leavenworth.
probably.
But Daniel R. Anthony, the younger brother of Susan B. Anthony, was who later became the mayor of Leavenworth in 1863 when he was a colonel in the Union Army, actually. He was a free stater and an Underground Railroad abolitionist and a women's suffragist, and a free thinker who was considered very colorful character. Daniel Reed Anthony. He from Leavenworth. He worked with one of the founders of the first Kansas Colored, who owned a local restaurant. Oh goodness, I can't remember his name, but he was a African American man who was later became the colonel of the first Kansas Colored, which was an Underground Railroad division or brigade in Kansas. And I'm just trying to think real quick, but anyway, it escapes me. However,
no worries.
Interesting man. And they worked together, and there's many others. And he printed up, when he found out through the telegraph line that Kansas had become a state on January 29th, they started ringing church bells in Leavenworth. He printed up a bunch of copies of his newspaper. I think it was the Leavenworth Daily, or what was it, the Leavenworth Times. He owned that later. He had a monopoly on Leavenworth Papers, which was the largest town in Kansas at that time. And which, he actually, another editor at that time who owned a different paper called him a coward and that man took a pot shot at him in the street, and Daniel Anthony killed him. He was acquitted for that crime by a local
Killed the
jury.
man who tried to shoot him.
Well,
Is that
they
what you were saying,
were
or-
basically, well, he killed a man in a duel, and that was a man named Satterley, who was another editor,
Yes.
an editor of another paper. And anyway, Daniel R. Anthony, you know, just like not only the Susan B. Anthony connection, but it was just an incredible character. And he went on into the 7th Kansas, which we'll also talk about later. But he printed up a bunch of copies of his paper, and he rode to Lawrence as quick as he could on horseback. Probably took a couple people with him. And but he definitely went himself and told the Kansas legislature sitting in Lawrence at that time, and the local newspaper editors, and of course the word went out immediately, because, you know, people were just dying for news out there. It was kind of just life on the plains, you know, and the church bell started ringing and pealing in Lawrence, Kansas too, that same day, because he was able to make it there on horseback. So that's basically the history of the early political part of how Kansas became a state.
Nice. So I guess then, since Kansas became a state, but I believe Missouri was technically a slave state, correct? So like, what was their reaction to this on the eastern border being, you know,
right, their western border, our eastern border, Kansas's eastern border. I'm us both sitting here in Wyandotte County right now, and on the far eastern border of Kansas.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Even though we're socially distanced here during the age of coronavirus, which brings us up to date, but however, during the time period we're speaking about, I'm sorry, I went off the railroads. What did you just ask?
Well, what was no, you're good. What was their reaction, you know, to
right,
to this,
well,
you know, basically?
Governor, the southern states all had conventions on whether to secede or not. And there's a term called the scallywag. You may have heard that. It's kind of a derogatory type pejorative
was that kind of came about during that time, or is that because
that's from that time.
Okay,
that's from
definitely.
that time. That's
I mean,
yes,
that is, you know, if someone calls you a scallywag, usually you're like less than desired person kind of thing.
Right, and it's got an interesting story, and it's not a sailor. It sounds like something you'd say somebody on a sailing ship.
That's what I was going to
scallywag, like a pirate or something. No, a scallywag was a person from the South who was pro-union and who was against secession.
Oh,
so the scallywags were actually a great bunch of people in terms of your perspective. I mean, if you're for the lost cause and all that, and you're still for the Confederacy winning, I guess you're pro-slavery in 2021. I guess they're bad, but I consider scallywags to be very honorable people, because they were basically pro-union people in the South, and they weren't necessarily Republicans. They were just people who didn't agree with secession. They wanted to be part of the Union still.
Sound like you kind of put a target on yourself if you're a scallywag, then, you know.
Well, the scallywags actually had more support than you'd believe. I mean, I've read a lot about the secessionist conventions and throughout the South. You know, the oh gosh, I can't even enumerate how many states, but we're talking about, you know, it started in South Carolina, and it went all through eventually Virginia and Mississippi and everywhere else, you know, down there, Florida and Arkansas. But Missouri was had a lot of unionists in it, and St. Louis was a big town back then. It was big like Cincinnati and different places in the middle of the country. It was on the Mississippi River, big like New Orleans, and it had a lot of Germans who would, you know, like famous Budweisers from, you know, the famous breweries. Famous German breweries are from St. Louis. Well, the Germans were a strong population there, and they were pro-union. And in the Missouri at that time, the Missourians were known as the Dutch. I mean, they weren't actually Dutch. They were known as Dutch. They were called Dutchies and Dutch, and they were Germans. And there was a lot of pro-union sentiment in Kansas City as well, and throughout the state, but there was a lot of pro-secessionist sentiment, And there is a flag in the stars and bars, the Confederate flag for Missouri. But Missouri never seceded from the Union because they had strong representation in Congress, and they had strong senators who stood by them. Now, the two senators, Waldo P. Johnson, and another, were expelled from the Senate because they were pro secessionist. Because the Claiborne Jackson, the governor of Missouri, was pro secessionist, but the majority of the state and the majority of the state constitutional convention to secede was against leaving the Union, and so they were forced out. They were forced out of the Senate by the Senate, and they were forced out of the. Claiborne Jackson was chased down into like basically near Carthage and Joplin. He hid out down there in southern southwest Missouri, on the kind of in the border there between Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, and Arkansas, and so they there was a lot of contention, but Missouri remained a very strong part of the Union throughout the Civil War. But there were a lot of pro-slavery people in Missouri, and Missouri remained a slave state throughout the war until, well, even after the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, signed and penned by Lincoln, only freed the slaves of the South and certain parts of Louisiana, which weren't under Union control. A lot of people don't understand the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves, so-called slaves. I call them the enslaved, but I hate the word slave. So degrading.
I can understand that. Yeah, no, definitely.
But anyway, the enslaved people of the northern states who had slavery, which I believe was Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and one other state. Can't remember right now. There were 5 that remained in the Union who were pro-slavery. Those slaves were not those enslaved people were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation.
I didn't know that.
The Kansans fixed that in 1862. And we'll get into that here in a little bit when one of your questions I'm aware of, because they went in and issued military emancipation orders in both Tennessee and Missouri, and they wouldn't let so-called slave catchers come into their camps to take people back. Well, so yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I was going to say, I didn't realize that about the Emancipation Proclamation. I was under the impression it was for everyone, but I feel like that would really put some buildup to what kind of led to the Civil War, just because you're telling all these southern states they can't have slaves while the northern states can. And I mean, I feel like that right there is just going to cause bad blood, because why am I being treated differently than these states up here? So yeah, no, I just found that really interesting. I honestly did not know that. So that, that's something I definitely learned, in this conversation, and I just found it really interesting.
Well, hopefully our many guests who will view this on YouTube later and are seeing us now, I don't know if they can send a love across. I haven't seen any loves. I know somebody's watching. I'd like to give a shout out to Chris Bond, who's out east, I believe, and one of our state representatives is watching, and others, friends of ours. But this will be on YouTube, and we'll get it out there. So this is a solid history. Yeah, learning about the Emancipation Proclamation and its relation to Missouri and the other slave states in the Union, it's important to realize, because it says a little bit about Lincoln, and it says a lot about the Civil War.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, then I guess kind of we're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, maybe, putting a sour taste in the South's mouth because of the way they are treated, I guess. What did Kansas residents and, the political leaders, what was, I guess, their reaction to the buildup towards the Civil War? Because I feel like we're kind of right on the border to a degree on, the line of what, because everyone below us was a southern state. So, we were kind of on the front line, I feel, it sounds like, right?
Right, because even in Oklahoma, which was then known as the Indian Territory, didn't become a state until I believe 1893 or 1894. I think it was 1893. But Oklahoma, Indian territory at that time, what they called the 5 civilized tribes, and they still call them the 5 civilized tribes, which is the Cherokees, Seminoles, Creeks, Choctaws, and Chickasaws, who came across the Trail of Tears. They all had slavery of one kind or another, but they also had abolitionists among them, very strong parties, very strong factions. And sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
My mom tried to call.
Oh,
anyway,
no, you're fine.
Sorry, I don't know how to fix that.
Nope, you're good. You're good.
Nevertheless, for posterity, hello, Mom. Talking about the Civil War here. Oh my God, I lost my train of thought. I was talking about the 5 civilized tribes.
Yes, so they all the build up to the Civil War.
The leaders of those tribes signed Confederate treaties with the guy out of Arkansas, general of the Confederate Army. Arkansas, of course, had seceded for real and was part of the Confederacy, as was Texas. Texas was the only independent nation that joined the Confederacy because the previous to that had been independent country. But and the Mexicans were against slavery for a long time. So like when we say remember the Alamo, Santa Anna, he was anti-slavery, and he came up there, and the Texans were pro-slavery. So I always said, yeah, remember the Alamo, go Santa Anna, because of my ideology, which is anti-slavery. I mean, I'm anti-slavery now. This is 2021. I mean, you gotta take a stand. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
but,
definitely.
I know about my history, but I'm still against it, even in its present day form, all over the world, sex trafficking or anything else, or definitely economic exploitation of the poor. However, this is straying a little off track, but
no.
On the Emancipation Proclamation, the political leaders of Kansas, of course, Jim Lane was elected as senator. Senator Pomeroy wasn't as active in abolitionism. Well, he was an abolitionist, but he had wheat mills and had burlap sacks with his name on it. He said Pomeroy. And there's still Pomeroys in Topeka today, the descendants, and around the state. And Pomeroy's because he had put his wheat in burlap sacks, had name recognition, because people would make clothing out of his burlap sacks because they didn't have a lot of materials back then to make.
I do remember that. Yeah.
And so people would literally have his name on their back, like like go Chiefs. It was like go Pomeroy. So he got elected. But anyway, Jim Lane was the real one who was and a very excitable, the most historic orator, the greatest orator in the history of Kansas was Jim Lane. And he made many speeches once he became a senator in Congress. I've read them in the United States Annals of Congress and stuff. And he was a great speaker in Kansas. He was a real stem winder, they used to call him. He'd get up there and he wore a bear coat and his hair stood all up like crazy like that. And mine went back down, but his stood up. And anyway, Senator Jim Lane was a leader of the radical abolitionist faction, and John Ritchie of Topeka was still around, who had been a friend of John Brown on the Underground Railroad. James Montgomery of Mound City, many of these people who were political leaders. Governor Charles Robinson of Lawrence was important. The Lane and Robinson factions had differences, and they had different newspapers. Because, of course, as the governor, he was supposed to be setting up the militias and the raising troops. But Jim Lane, as a new senator, declared himself a general. In 1862, they marched into Missouri and issued a military proclamation emancipating the slaves of Missouri, which was a Union state.
So how did that? How well did that go over?
The Emancipation Proclamation freed the enslaved of Jefferson Davis. And so the Kansans were radical. They did the same, and Daniel or Anthony did the same thing when he got to Tennessee. He wouldn't allow the so-called slave catchers into their camps after people would flock. flock to their camps for safety and freedom. So many people freed themselves out of Missouri. When I say free themselves, it's a good book. There's a good book called I Freed Myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about people taking their own agency into power to free themselves. Of course, many had white abolitionist friends, and different Native American and Jewish settlers, different female and male, all kinds of different people of different types of religious backgrounds helped people. And then, of course, the military, like I just mentioned, the Kansas regiments, particularly the 5th and 7th, and different ones freed many people, and lots of African American, Black descendant freed people, military freed or freed themselves, came into Kansas, which was known as the Promised Land to them, and joined the Kansas colored regiments. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Kansas Colored came into being during the war. And so it was a very political time. It was very contentious. And there was still a war on the border that had come from the territorial period. There was still a lot of bad blood, but a lot more bad blood came into existence after the Civil War. I'll tell you that much. Between Kansas and Missouri, Indian Territory, and Arkansas and so forth, there was a lot of bad blood. There were some people down in the hills. I don't know if you've ever been to Arkansas, but the northern part of Arkansas is kind of like the Ozarks. And it's real hilly. It's real hilly down there in the northern part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like hills, up and down and around and around. And there was these pro-union, because Arkansas had seceded from the Union, and so there was these pro-union hillbillies, basically. I mean, I'm not saying that in a derogatory way, but they were like
they were people that lived in the hills, mountains,
hill people. Yeah,
definitely.
Seriously, and I'm not putting them down. I'm saying they were called the Mountain Feds. They were pro-union, and they fought against they were a mounted cavalry that fought against the Southern Arkansas Guard and stuff. So there's a lot going on in Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Indian Territory, and
so
Missouri.
I guess talking about kind of like the different factions that you mentioned, I know you mentioned a couple different regiments, and then kind of the I guess not in a derogatory term, but the hillbillies in Arkansas who were pro-union. I guess can you like expand maybe on some of the other regiments that I guess that were like in Kansas that made it one of the most ideologically abolitionist groups of fighters, I guess you could say.
Right, because Kansas had, at the time of the Civil War started in 1861. The Kansas had 30,000 men of military age.
Okay.
And they enlisted 20,000 of that existing proportion, which is,
so 2/3 of
two-thirds of farm eligible or adult eligible males joined the Union Army, which was a huge amount. It gave
I mean, I could only imagine 2/3 of the Kansas population joining I guess the armed force. I know now that wouldn't be a thing, but that's kind of crazy to think about, honestly, I feel.
Exactly. And the Kansas had 8,500 casualties, which made it per capita the biggest losses. And I mean, and that was casualties, but it's a little bit lower with the deaths.
Mm-hmm.
But they had the largest per capita deaths through battle and battle deaths and disease of any other state in the Union. And so we paid a fair price of blood for freedom right here in Kansas. And this is why it's important for this issue to go out, Gavin, because Kansas has a proud heritage of fighting for freedom. It has a proud heritage of fighting for Black freedom. It has a proud heritage of fighting for multiracial cooperation. And this is something that needs to be renewed and remembered and publicized and promoted, because so many things now are negative about Kansas. But famous book, What's the Matter with Kansas? Yes. I put out a Facebook post today. What's the matter with Patrick? Why does he care about Kansas? Well, It's because of all these things I'm talking about, and multiculturalism and freedom and fighting for it is, I want to talk about I want to talk about the Native American troopers, which were established by the Kansas Regimental Soldier or Confederates, or the officer class, as well, before we're done. But
Yeah, definitely.
go ahead.
Oh, well, no, I mean,
I answered your political question about Kansas.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that? Or I guess we're the bushwhackers, I guess, basically the quote unquote enemy of, the abolitionists in Kansas, or I guess,
well,
what were they exactly? I guess I know. And we kind of talked about this last time, that, what they were pro-slavery.
Well, real quick, I'll talk about the bushwhackers, but let me.
Oh, yeah. No,
they're
that's
an
fine.
important. No, they're important. I mean, they burned down Lawrence in 1863.
Oh, definitely.
Killed 150 unarmed men and boys. In that, I believe it was in August of 1863.
So yeah, I mean, I guess you want to expand on the
the regiments. Real quick.
the regiments. Yeah, sorry about that.
I mainly studied the Kansas 5th Cavalry, the 7th Cavalry, which is Jennison's Jayhawkers, the 5th Cavalry with Lieutenant Colonel John Ritchie, Colonel Hamilton Johnson, who was a Methodist, and again, Jim Lane. He called himself a general, but it was against the Constitution for him to be a general and a senator at the same time. So he wouldn't leave the Senate. So he quit calling himself a general. But he had this problem with Governor Robinson, because Robinson was more of a gradualist and didn't really want to see the Civil War come on.
Oh, the incremental change.
Lane took hold of it.
Mm-hmm.
And Robinson did good work, but he was more of an incrementalist. But he founded the University of Kansas. He did a lot of, which was co-educational and co-racial in 1865, which is progressive.
Definitely.
And he was a woman suffragist, and he was a anti-slavery guy. But I'm not putting down Governor Robinson. He was just more of a gradualist. But Lane took it up, and let's see, they went down, and they, like I already mentioned, they issued that military proclamation, military emancipation order in Missouri, which was still part of the Union. And that put Lincoln in a bind, because he had to deal with the senators of Missouri.
Oh, I bet you they were infuriated.
Well, they were definitely pro-Union, but they were mad that Kansans coming into Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but since you mentioned it, I want to talk about the Native American troopers and the black troopers too. But
yeah,
since you mentioned it, this is a good time to segue into the bushwhackers. Who were the bushwhackers? What is a bushwhacker? A bushwhacker is a black flagger. It's not somebody who was it wasn't really part of the CSA, the Confederate States of America. It wasn't a sanctioned group among the Confederate Army. They were basically, a lot of them didn't even, they had no slavery. They had no ties. Culturally, they did. They had no income themselves. They were just a bunch of, they were disgruntled with the politics of the era, because they had a barter economy, and they didn't want to see a bunch of northern banks and northern railroads and everything come in. Jesse James was a bushwhacker. Bloody Bill Anderson is a famous one. George Todd was a famous one. William Clark Quantrell was, of course, the most famous, who led these others that I just mentioned into Lawrence in 1863 and burned it down. But the bushwhackers were unaffiliated fighters, and they were mounted. They used the 1845 Navy Colt revolver.
Just run in and shoot us.
If you can picture Outlaw Josie Wales, this is the kind, and that movie's about the bushwhackers.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, that's a novel, but I mean, it's a true story where it's got a historical fiction to it, And but Bloody Bill Anderson, you can think that's a great pirate name, but he's more known as a land pirate.
Yeah,
a black flagger, and they actually used to call them land pirates and stuff like that. But I mean, that
kind of makes sense.
Jennison's Jayhawkers, the 7th Cavalry, they did some awful things too. They burned down a lot of houses in the Burnt District, which was about from Jackson down to Vernon County, which is about 4 or 5 counties. There was a evacuation order for the populace under General Ewing, called General Order Number 11. which created a vacuum of power and left a lot of people. They forced everybody into either fortified towns in those districts or made them come all the way to Jackson County and abandon their farmsteads. And then Jennison's Jayhawkers went and burned them down. And there was a lot of just like chimneys left out of cabins, right?
Yeah,
And
definitely.
they were known as Jennison's chimneys. And so there was deprivations on both sides. There was innocent people killed. There was people who were what they called unconditional or non-conditional, non-committal, where they were trying to just be neutral, and they were hung and stuff by both sides. And we talked about the border wars in our last podcast,
Yes.
or our last video cast, and there was a lot of violence in bleeding Kansas, but there was a lot more violence in the period of the early Civil War that lasted throughout the Civil War and lasted even afterwards. About the Native American troopers in Indian Territory, they were established by Kansas Jayhawkers or Kansas abolitionists. John Ritchie of Topeka being one of the main ones who organized the Second Indian Home Guard, and the first black troops who were in the Union Army of the Civil War period, because there was black soldiers in the Revolutionary period in the War of 1812. So they weren't the first black soldiers ever to fight in the United States cause, but they were the first black soldiers ever registered or mustered into Union rolls during the Civil War period were actually black Indians who had come across the Trail of Tears with the Seminoles and the Creeks and the Cherokees, and they had been considered slaves. But the Seminoles being from Florida, people used to escape south to Florida from Georgia, and the Seminoles protected them and gave them their own villages, and they had their own agency in Florida. The Florida Seminoles were the only tribe of the 5 civilized tribes who never signed a treaty of submission with the United States government. And so there were black Indian soldiers who were initiated into the muster rolls in 1862 by people like John Ritchie in Baxter Springs, Kansas, and Apathle Yahola, who was a name which means white hare, like white rabbit, in Upper Creek, the Muskogee language. He came across. There was an internecine civil war, the abolitionists versus the pro-slavers amongst the Creeks, the Cherokees, and the Seminoles. And so Apathle Yahola, white hair, came up into Kansas with his people during what they almost called like a second Trail of Tears, which was really, because it was really cold when they came up. They mustered them into the Indian Home Guard, and the first black soldiers of the Civil War were actually black Indians.
Oh, I did not know that at all. That's
Most
actually really
people
good
don't,
to know.
so that's why I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, no.
And now, of course, a lot of Underground Railroad African Americans, and blacks came across and fought in the Kansas regiments, thousands. And I once said in a speech, Kansas was the promised land to them. How long is it going to be before Kansas lives up to its promises? But nevertheless, that's the story of the Indian Home Guard, the Kansas colored regiments, and the Kansas regiments that I wanted to discuss.
Yeah, no, that's actually really interesting. Because I do know that the Native American population even kind of still holds true to that tradition a lot. They actually do enlist a lot of times. One of my mentors actually is one of those people who's Native, and he signed up and fought in the forces. To this day even. So that's actually really interesting to know that in Kansas they were embracing that back then, instead of, I guess, kind of subjugating them, if you will. So wow, that's really interesting. I guess so. I guess kind of we could wrapping this up maybe a little bit, I guess. So, and we've kind of talked about it. I feel like you kind of answered this earlier, but so what do you think I guess why all this should make us kind of proud, to be Kansas, or I guess why should this make us proud is, for Kansas as our heritage and stuff like that, which I feel like you kind of answer that all through it. But I guess what would your main takeaways be from that, to kind of liken it today?
Even the word heritage has a political connotation now as being kind of like the lost cause, or when people use the word heritage, it's kind of like, well, this is my white heritage. It's almost like a racist term.
I can, yes.
And I mean, I gave you that question, and I admit that, and so the Kansas heritage, I guess, is not, I'm not talking about white supremacy or anything.
Oh yeah.
I'm talking about quite the opposite. The heritage of Kansas, without using the pejorative of the word heritage as it's being used now, and not to be a cancel culture guy, but
yeah, definitely.
Because everybody has free speech. I'm an anti-censorship person. I believe in free speech. Anybody can come on here and on YouTube and comment all they want all day long if they want to about how I'm wrong, or how, I mean, this is factual information from, primary sources in history. I read the old newspapers. This isn't just coming out of the straight history books, because obviously you've learned a few things, and you know what you're talking about. But I mean, I've told you some things. I've told people things during this presentation that a lot of people just don't know about, including the Emancipation Proclamation and the meaning, and the black soldiers, the black Indian soldiers, and several different hidden histories of Kansas heritage that, and I don't prefer the word heritage, but I'm talking about our cultural heritage. The Kansans should be proud that we were a free state. They should understand what a free state means. They should understand that we stood together with the downtrodden. The people came here from all over the country, from the north, from Massachusetts, from Indiana, from Ohio, from different places all over the country, Pennsylvania, to fight for freedom. And they fought all the way. They got into the Constitution. They got into the Congress. They got into the statehood, 34th state in the Union in 1861, January 29th, Kansas Day, which we're celebrating.
Yeah,
and definitely. And so, it's a history of multiculturalism. It's a history of multicultural cooperation. It's a history of people helping each other out for the right cause, which is freedom, and for literal freedom, and dying for it.
Definitely.
In great numbers. I mean, 20,000 enlisted out of 30,000 eligible, and 8,500 were injured or died. That's a lot. That's a huge sacrifice. And that's what I'm talking about with, let's call it a legacy of Kansas. Okay.
I like that term. I really, that's I do like that much better than heritage, because
I like legacy better too. Yeah. So we'll call it that. But I'm not going to fault you on that, because I did send you that line, just to be frank.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. So I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot, and I really surprised about the Emancipation Proclamation, because I feel like in school they kind of just tell you that's when Lincoln signed that to free the slaves, but really it was only in the southern states, which, learning that tidbit, you can kind of think of, the more pressure, I guess, it put on, that caused the Civil War and stuff like that, or the negatives between the North and South.
So the war had
it would already start, I guess, but I guess made the tension worse, I guess you could say, right?
Only certain districts of only freed the enslaved of certain districts of Louisiana, but certain districts of Louisiana remained under Union control throughout the war, so it didn't free them.
Definitely.
So this is and Kansas played a huge part in American history. Kansas is important. The 34th star in the Union. This is a 34. You can't see it. I have to go back, but that's the Kansas flag. That's the United States flag when there was 34 stars, is what I've got in my background. And I'm really proud to be from Kansas. I'm proud to be. I've lived a lot of my life in Missouri, in Kansas City, Missouri.
Yeah.
Kansas has its
issues traitor
now.
No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Well, it's a fun town.
Kid.
It's a big metropolitan area.
No, definitely.
I had a lot of fun there. It's kind of my stomping grounds, but I live in Kansas again now. I work in Kansas. I live in Kansas. I pay taxes in Kansas. Too much, pretty much, for my wage. I love it. However,
I feel that.
I'll let you end it up.
Oh yeah, no. So I really do appreciate you being on this. I guess we call this the second part of maybe some Kansas history lecture. I hope when we can have another one. I'm sure there'll be some, anniversary of some past event that we can do another one on. Just
Right.
have to kind of look forward a little bit more to see what one of those might be.
Sounds
But
good.
I enjoyed it.
I'd like to do more. I have a lot of knowledge about the Native American troops, and so I'd like to do one on that someday, just specifically about what happened in Indian Territory with the Kansas Abolitionist commanders.
Oh, I would I would greatly, I would, yeah, I would greatly like that. Well, then,
yeah, we can work that out.
Yeah, definitely. We'll keep in touch on that. And then I guess we can kind of wrap it up. I appreciate anyone who watched, and sorry I couldn't get to comments. I'm still working out, watching Facebook and doing the Zoom all at the same time. So, but maybe next time we can get some questions from the audience, maybe on our next one, talking about the Native American Regiment, which I would be greatly interested in.
Did you get some comments during this subject?
I did. Let me, you know what, if you can, do you want to hold a sec? We got a couple more.
Yeah.
Let me go here. It just going between all the tabs, and it doesn't streamline as much as I'd like it, but let me see here. Well, and you know what? It shows me 10 comments, but I only see 4, and that's what annoys me.
Well, go ahead. And what are the 4 comments?
Well, nope.
Are they from Missourians?
No, actually, one is are they from Missourians, right? I don't know if I have any Missourians watching. Maybe. I
put it out there.
Well, so I guess really some of them are just kind of talking amongst themselves, but one of them was asking why did so many people want Kansas to become a slave state? They just can't understand why they would want to be, I guess, a slave state instead of being a free state back then. And so I don't know.
Well, Kansas had good agricultural land, and it was fertile, and it was on the Missouri border, which was, they considered Kansas to be their territory. So I mean, they wanted to grow hemp, and they wanted to, which is widely raised.
Yeah.
They wanted to grow crops, and they wanted to use slave labor in order to do it. So I mean, it makes sense. Kansas was a wide open prairie, wide open economic territory for settlement, and slavery was considered a viable economic form at the time. So I mean, that's the answer to that question. But I mean, I find it abhorrent, but that's why it happened. That's why it was,
and that makes complete sense. And see. And see, now it shows me 11 comments, but I only see 4. See, that's why it's a little buggy.
I'm glad you got some comments. That's
yeah,
cool.
No, well,
wrap this up.
Well, yeah, we'll wrap it up for sure. I appreciate, everyone who watched for this, second, I guess, installment of, Kansas history with Patrick Sumner. I hope to have another one soon. Maybe we'll talk about some of the regiments, and specifically the Native American regiment you were mentioning earlier. That does greatly, it kind of hits home for me. One of my mentors is Native American. He's still with us. And so that's really interesting to me. And I appreciate you being on here, Patrick, on Kansas Day, 160th Kansas Day, correct?
Yes.
And so with that, I guess we'll close for the night. And Patrick, I will talk to you and keep in touch. And hopefully here we'll have another one.
Sounds great.
Hey, have a good night, everyone.